Hello, my wonderful friends. I'm back again for another walking it through, and this time I'm not in Paris. I'm actually further south, nearer my house, and me and Pinky are out at the moment. She's going after sticks in the river, what we call the source. Come on then, Pinky. And I've got my New Zealand hat on for my wonderful New Zealand fam who sent me a video yesterday, which made me cry. You know who you are, thank you very much. And my Slippery Rock jumper from our time at the workshop at Slippery Rock. Okay, what am I going to talk to you about today? So today I'm going to talk to you about research, specifically how we can get tied up in believing that the only thing that is worthwhile when we're thinking about science is if it's a peer-reviewed paper and it's written down for everybody, not always everybody to read, because it's sometimes those papers are behind locked gates that you have to pay for. But ultimately, the ultimate we are told to believe, to look towards, come on Pinky, here she comes, is peer-reviewed research. Now, there's a lot of things that we need to unpick there, and one of those things is that peer-reviewed research is not invalid at all. Of course it's not. Peer-reviewed research is good when it's produced with understanding all the different variables that need to be taken into consideration, which is not always that feasible, of course. And oftentimes when peer-reviewed research is undertaken, people are honing down on a particular part of something that they're interested in, something that will get funding, something that their university, if they're part of a university, will get funding for, something that other people, pharmaceutical interests, when they're looking for creating a new drug, for instance, or in more technical aspects, when companies are looking to develop specific technical models that are going to help further whatever it is that the research is doing. Plus lots of other things as well when it comes to science of being and science of self and understanding what makes people tick. For instance, at the moment, I'm looking at lots of information with my obsessive personality that I've got. I'm looking at things like ADHD, which I believe that I have, and I'm not terribly upset about that. I think it's marvellous, because being slightly neurodivergent means that I'm able to hyper-focus on the things that are very important and interest me, but it does mean that there are other things in life that I kind of let go of, which is really interesting because it's called an attention deficit disorder. But in fact, people with ADHD don't have attention deficit whatsoever. They actually, when it comes to things that they're interested in, they can actually do the opposite of that. They can really put their attention to it, really hyper-focus. And because of that, they can find out things that perhaps other people might not actually see as being something that they can hyper-focus on. Anyway, I digress. Research. So the way that it has gone over the last 100 years or so is that we've headed more and more towards this hierarchical way of looking at science. That means that unless you're in a university or you have professor status, you've gone through the right channels to get to where you are a researcher, you're labelled a researcher, you're working with researchers, then that's an easier way for you to access, or you're working in companies, it's an easier way for you to access funding to do peer-reviewed research. But all of this research, first of all, so it's not so easy for people like me, and or Bethan or GTL, for instance. And all of this research has to start somewhere. And usually it starts with an idea, a hypothesis, born out of a question that maybe still is unanswered. And when we look at research currently in laminitis, we are inundated, in fact, with induction models. What does that mean? It means that some horses were selected to go into studies, usually a cohort of well below 30, which is very typical in certain equine studies, and it's very difficult to extrapolate out to the entire species when you're using such a small cohort. However, the induction studies were taking a set of horses in a specific part of the world, often Australia, because that's where many of these studies were taken, although they have been done in other places in the world, but it depends on the ethics committee and what they will pass. Taking these horses and giving them a carbohydrate overload, an oligofructose, for instance, overload, to create an inflammatory response in their system, in the hope that it will show them that there is an inflammatory response going on in the feet, which will then indicate that diet is responsible for this word laminitis, or part of the story. The problem is that these induction models that were done were first and foremost with that question in mind: is it the gut? Is it something systemic that is causing these problems that we see? And what are the problems that we see? We see horses that are sore. We see horses that are shuffling about. But primarily, we see horses that have got P3 looking like it's completely in the wrong position compared to the hoof capsule around it. And that's primarily diagnosed by initially looking at the animal, seeing that it is lying down or uncomfortable, reluctant to walk, looking like it potentially might be unwell or not, and then taking an X-ray, taking blood tests to see if the horse has any indications that it might be on a spectrum of metabolic issues, disorders. So that's kind of what you do. And then if you, that's a sort of the route to diagnosis. And so the question in research was, is it the diet that's causing that? That was sort of broadly the question. And so these induction models were done, a set of horses were taken, and they were studied. They had controls where horses weren't they didn't induce the systemic overload. But of course, you've got to remember that when you're taking, often in these studies, around about 20 horses, and you split those up into groups, and you often have 3 groups, or sometimes 4. Every single time you do that, the group that you're looking at specifically for results gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So you end up with, out of 20, potentially only 5 horses that you're looking at to compare to those other horses in your study that might give you an indication. But it's not unequivocal, obviously. So I hope, let's just give you a look where I'm walking now. Look at that. Isn't that lovely? It says Pinky. Hello, Pinky. That's behind me. That's so lovely. This is just one of the many thousands of forests that are in France that are just beautiful to walk through and usually completely empty, which is quite useful because I'm talking to myself. Okay, where did I get to? So these induction models, and so with that question in mind, they were specifically looking at the internal influence on the feet. We should make a funny noise then. The internal influence on the feet. What they weren't looking at was the external influence on the feet. And in fact, there are many papers now that exist looking at the internal influence, but there are very, very few that show good sequential data following the influence of human beings and their trimming styles on feet. In fact, barely any at all of any worth that really did follow horses over any specific time. It may be mentioned, but no real parameters are shown. You don't get to see photographs of the feet, maybe just one or two, but you don't get a full sequential set over months. You don't get full sequential sets of x-rays over months. You don't get to see what the effect of certain trimming styles are. For instance, one of the trimming styles, I am digressing a little bit, just bear with me. One of the trimming styles that has become a massive fad over the last 15, 20 years, and it's so increasingly so now, which was not the case many years before that, is removing toe off hooves, specifically off front hooves, because we are nervous, the humans are nervous of laminitis, they're nervous of separation, they're nervous of strain on the laminae at the toe on the of the horse. But rather oddly, if you look at my It's Not Rocket Science lesson that I did on Monday, where I compared front feet to back feet, you'll notice that I mentioned that in back feet, one of the most common presentations that we find with hind feet is negative palmar angle. Now, that's more commonly caused by heels being in the correct place or not far off, but the toe mass, the vertical height, if you like, has been left in excess. It's thundering. Oh shit, I think I might get caught out in the rain and the thunder. So in other words, the toe is too long, and that gives a low heel, long toe presentation that people often talk about. But we've got to be very careful when we use terms like that. Phrases like, that horse looks like it's got long toe, low heel, because that's visually our perception, but we need to be able to understand vertical depth and heel height, vertical toe depth and heel height, and look at certain parameters to really establish whether that horse has got separation and therefore showing a long heeling toe. It's not long, it's distorted. Or whether in fact you're looking, and the foot is balanced and heeling, or whether in fact you're looking at a foot that is not dorsopalmally balanced with too much toe, as in vertical toe depth, not too much toe going forward horizontally, which is obviously with separation and heeling. So there's a big distinction. So just saying terms like shorten the toe, raise the heels, these ooh, that was a bug. These are not specific terms. Why are we not saying, well, I want you to shorten the toe specifically by so many millimeters into the white line, into the water line, being more specific? Obviously, we don't encourage that at all. When you've got too much toe vertically, then you're removing it vertically. You're not removing it from a horizontal plane, if you like. Anyway, I slightly digress. But the point is, when you have a vast majority of horses walking around the world with imbalanced hooves, with shortened toes at the front and longer toes on the hinds, we don't see the separation as much on the hinds as we do on the front. Now, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because we should, in fact, be, if this is a metabolic problem, we should, in fact, be looking at all 4 feet, because metabolism just doesn't affect the front feet. We see laminitis more in the front feet because what we're seeing is a distorted hoof capsule that has not aligned with anatomical constants. Whereas in the hind feet, we still have a distortion in a way, but not in the same way that has caused stress, tearing, and problems with the laminae. It's definitely causing stress to the system, to the horse's biomechanics. And what's so scary is that most owners, trainers, anybody that basically is not a hoof care person, and in fact many hoof care people and many other equine professionals don't appreciate that fact and don't understand that balance, don't understand that anatomical balance. It's done very subjectively, visually. So let's just go back to the research. So the question was, is there inflammation of the laminae being caused by overdosing the body with a carbohydrate overload? Well, what we see in these animals, in these studies, is that we see a general sickness beginning that becomes quite catastrophic to the system. These are ethically allowed, they are passed for ethics, but they are quite horrific studies because they are causing deliberately immeasurable suffering to these animals. But because there's an end point, for example, 7 or 8 days, and then the horse is put to sleep, that's seen as ethically okay. But for those days, that animal is suffering badly. Now, what they're finding is that there are all kinds of metabolic issues occurring when they do this. It's not just a foot thing per se. They get tachycardia, they get horrible colic systems, pawing the ground, lying down in terrible pain, while the researchers note it down in their notebook. Oh, look, these are some of the observations I'm making as we've overloaded this animal, as we've basically put it into a cytokine storm, and we've basically caused this horse to be horrifically, catastrophically unwell. In some of the studies, horses in these small cohorts didn't even make it through the studies because they were so poorly with tachycardia and colic, just naming 2, that they were taken out of the studies, put to sleep early before the studies could continue. So it is well known that in these studies that they're looking for foot issues. We've also got other tremendous issues going on. Well, as we've all found out, horses that are suffering from laminitis and foot issues don't necessarily have tachycardia. They don't necessarily have colic either. And they actually don't necessarily have blood tests that show that they have EMS. Some do, some don't. Many don't. And that is an even bigger question. Why do we have horses that are showing no metabolic issues whatsoever, presenting with problems in their feet, and they don't even follow these induction models, these where they've had to induce with these high levels of carbohydrate these issues in these horses? So there are far more questions than there are answers. And unfortunately, in the equine world, it feels like everybody's got to the answer. And the answer is diet must be causing it. But there are far too many horses out there with terrible diets, really overweight, that have perfectly fine feet. There are too many horses out there that have absolutely no metabolic problems at all, with horrific feet. And there are far too many horses out there with front feet that are horribly distorted and hind feet that are too long in the toe, which are not causing separation of the laminae. And these are things, many questions like this, that have not been answered. And the reason they haven't been answered is because peer-reviewed research into laminitis has, and the reason I do it in inverted commas is because it is not the disease everybody thinks it is. So the problem is that these unanswered questions will remain unanswered until the science community goes, actually, just let's stop harming these horses with these induction models and doing something we can obviously see is going to cause them harm, which is overdosing their systems, causing these horrible catastrophic metabolic breakdowns, which would never happen naturally in their day-to-day life because they just couldn't overload themselves as much as that. Instead of looking at that now, because we've looked at it for many years, from the middle of the 90s and before, but very, very much so in the last 20, 25 years, over and over and over, trying to find that special golden egg drug that's going to stop it all. And they've not found it because they haven't looked at all they haven't asked all the questions, and they've got very few answers, very, very few. And those answers do not directly say definitely that horses have got inflammation in their feet and tearing of the laminae because of diet. What they show is that horses' systems break down when they're overloaded unnaturally, but we never saw what the laminae looked like before we did the studies. Plus, in these studies, they predominantly looked at front feet. Why didn't they look at hind feet? Some studies mentioned more than 1 foot, but weren't particularly clear. Only certain portions of the laminae were looked at. These horses weren't assessed. They were assessed more objectively before they went into the studies, and very occasionally there was a radiograph done. But mostly there was no history. Often these horses come from end of life places, and I don't mean end of life because they've got a disease. I mean end of life because nobody wants them anymore. So slaughterhouses, places like that, where these horses are chosen, and even in a small cohort like 20, and sometimes they use even less than that. Remember, they divide them up into their controls, etc., meaning the cohort is even smaller and smaller and smaller. They can't take all these horses and do these induction models on them all at once. They can only take a few at a time. So, for instance, in Chris Pollitt's work in the University of Queensland, he would take, he often talks about it in his papers, say 3 horses at a time. But the questions that then need to be asked are, what's happening to the hooves of the horses that are not now in the study at the moment, that are waiting in the waiting room of death, where they're just waiting to be put into this study, harmed or not, and then put to sleep after 8 days, and then their laminae looked at. What's happening to those? What's happening to their feet? Did these horses, or were they already predisposed to these issues because they were suffering from chronic imbalance? Well, as we've found out with the furore in the world about what we're doing, and the way that we are being scrutinised now, the world doesn't understand imbalance at all. It thinks it knows what balance means, but it's doing it from a very exterior of the hoof, visual, subjective, in your mind, what you think it should be, based on the people that you follow, whether you think that's balance or not. It's not based on anatomical balance, which is what the horse needs, not what the human thinks it should be. So, and that was another rocket science lesson I did, not last Monday, the Monday before. I'm going up a hill. There we go. Absolutely Nobody around. So the point is that these studies were not enough by a long stretch. There are still hundreds of questions that have not been answered, yet the focus, the hyper-focus, has been on just that one tiny question: is diet causing these issues? And they've not come up with an answer. They still haven't proved that rotation happens because of it. There may be one paper that says looked like there was some kind of change. And they gauge that often by radiographs. But we all know that if you look at papers, research papers on radiographs and taking radiographs that radiographers have to study, when you're doing radiographs of feet particularly, it's a manual process, usually, using a portable X-ray machine. That means the more portable you get with an X-ray machine, the more the human is involved in that process of handling and positioning that X-ray machine, the more room you have for error. And we see a lot of error. We have GTL, Gauntlet Track Livery, Beth and Thornycroft, and myself and Hoofing Marvellous have done so many radiographs. Hundreds now. And even when we use calibrated blocks, even when we use, try to be very, very careful, and our vet tries to be extremely careful at keeping it consistent, there can be slight changes even in between an X-ray taken now and an X-ray taken straight after, let alone an X-ray taken now, one a few hours later, or now and one a few days later, or now and one a few weeks or a few months later. It's a problem. So if your X-ray is not in exactly the right position, then you're going to have errors appear when you compare those two X-rays. Now, on the gross side of things, you can still see separation or not. But on the micro on the micro side of things, you can't see whether those laminae are particularly under stress or not. So the only way to work that out is to see if the horse is shuffling about or is lying down or isn't very happy. But then we have to be super careful whether those horses are sick, shuffling about because they don't feel very well, like you trundling off to the toilet when you've got flu. You don't march off all confidently, you shuffle about, but your feet aren't hurting. Or they look perfectly fine, but they can't stand up. They hurt, their feet hurt. So, going back to the peer-reviewed research on laminitis, and peer-reviewed research, because I have been speaking for 28 minutes, and the peer-reviewed research in general, the problem that you have is that now we've gone so far in our world of science towards that, we are now starting to stifle independent thinking. Because if everybody goes, no, the peer-reviewed research paper has been done, therefore we don't need to look any further, that's the end of the story. Yeah, but it isn't even an inch into the story. There is no cure for it, because what we're finding is it isn't a disease at all. Because if you don't do those induction studies and you take horses that truly have rotation, what appears to be sinking, but in fact is just another consequence of the hoof capsule being trimmed incorrectly, and you take those horses and you rehab them, either keeping them on the same diet, changing the diet, or not, and you successfully grow out that separation by maintaining very specific parameters of the hoof capsule, then you have to start thinking, hang on a minute, Now, this isn't peer-reviewed research we're doing. Of course it isn't. We can't get hold of that kind of funding right now. What we are doing is funding our own clinical, in inverted commas, soft research. The end point for us is recovery. The end point, actually, I don't even think there is an end point in rehab, because one of the big major issues of rehab is not the rehab itself, is what happens when people at the end of that journey think that horse is rehabbed and then they can go off and ride it and do all the things that they were doing previously, change trimmers, and then ultimately start removing toe, leaving heels higher, and they don't even know they're doing it. They don't even know they're doing it because they're just going from visual perception. They still can't get out of their head that a toe on a front foot that might look long could cause separation. Yet we've proven in the animals that we've looked at that doesn't happen. And the world has proven it in all the MPAs that are walking around the planet that don't have lamini separation, of which there are hundreds of thousands. So peer-reviewed research and this belief that there is nothing better than peer-reviewed research, first of all, is a little bit ignorant, because the scientific community will tell you that not all peer-reviewed research is worth the paper it's written on. And some of it is quite nefarious, and some of it messes around with the statistics, etc. What we're doing is we are independently thinking. We are not going to be squashed by that. We are not following what the world wants us to follow, because we have questions that haven't been answered. And we need to look at those questions. And we're the only ones pushing forward and saying, let's look at it. I would love if peer-reviewed research is what you think is the pinnacle, then I would love that to happen. But it has to be done with a mindset that is curious, a mindset that's going, yeah, you're right, you know something, we've done all this research, we've done all these induction models, and we've not cured the disease. And that goes, well, maybe it isn't a disease. Maybe the primary leader of separation and lamini problems and the rotation we see in the sinking is not the DDFTs, not the long toes. This group over here is showing that horses with long toes don't have that. And in fact, the whole world has shown it with the MPAs. So maybe what we should be looking at is the effect of the human and their trim on the foot. Is it consistent enough? Is anybody taking photographs? No. Are they consistent? No. People often say to us, well, I've had the same farrier for 15 years. All my other horses are great, but one that isn't. Or I've had the same farrier for 15 years and only now have I started to get problems. People are not consistent. And if you're an owner saying those kind of things, you need to be taking photographs a lot. Not just selfies of you and your animal. You need to be taking photographs of the feet, proper photographs. Remember what I said about radiographs? When they're slightly in the wrong position, it can change the look of the capsule. That's why you have to be doing those sorts of things. And that's what we train our hoof care professionals to do. And I have to tell you, it is not easy for them. They start trimming, they think they've got a good handle on it. Then we start talking about the parameters that will guide them into a more anatomically stable hoof capsule. And sometimes they feel like they can't trim anymore. They're like, oh my God, I'm overthinking it now. So it's very hard, this. And we're at the forefront of trying to understand this. And currently, hoof care is very much guided around the principle that laminitis will just strike. And it could strike at any time. Horses on or off grass, winter, summer, spring, autumn, could just strike at any time. And that, my goodness, it's this horrible Damocles sword hanging over every owner's head, where in actual fact, nobody's gone, well, let's look at the effect of the human, the trimming styles, this absolute fad of removing the toe and not understanding where the heel should be. Taking the toe pillar which is always meant to be on the ground, off the ground, and expecting there to be no deleterious effect to that foot. In fact, you think it's going to heal the foot, but suddenly you've affected growth rates, slowing down and speeding up front to back. That has a super catastrophic effect on the inside tissues when you've got the capsule going in a different direction to the tissues inside. So the crux of this whole walking it through with me is that you can't, well, you can if you like, but peer-reviewed research is not the pinnacle of understanding. It's just showing you that somebody had a question, they were in a position where they could request funding for it, and they looked at something very specific. It doesn't give you all the answers, especially when there are people out there going, hang on a minute, for all those reasons I said earlier about the horses that don't fit into those categories. There have to be answers to these other questions. So peer-reviewed research and just believing that that is the only thing that is viable for good results is incorrect. It stifles intellectual and independent thinking, critical thinking. What we are doing is not harming horses. We are critically thinking around those questions that were never answered. And specifically, what are the effects of the hoof capsule to the hoof capsule when you bring it back into balance, when these horses are presenting with lamini separation? And the effect is, on every single horse that we work on, they improve. The lamini separation begins to reduce if, and only if, you are super specific at keeping certain parameters very, very, very closely controlled, i.e. trimming parameters. The problem is that the domestic horse, unlike the wild horse, can't do that with its own feet because it doesn't move enough. It's stuck in stables for hours and hours on end. It's trained on sand arenas for a few hours a week. Occasionally it goes on a ride, but God forbid you let them do that with their own feet. They put shoes on to protect the feet. And ironically, all of these things that they do to the domestic horse just stops the horse being able to have contact with the ground and also being able to trim themselves. Wouldn't that be the thing that everybody wants? Self-trimming and balance that the horse maintains. That doesn't happen because, unfortunately, we just don't set up the environments for that, which is where tracks come in to help those horses maintain the balance for longer before intervention needs before you need to intervene. So we should not be stifling critical thinking. We should not be looking at some of the studies that we're doing, even though they're not peer reviewed. We shouldn't be looking at our studies and going, ha ha ha, you've not got peer reviewed studies, therefore it's useless. No, because the only reason that you came up with the question you wanted answering in your peer-reviewed paper was because somebody came up with that question beforehand because they'd observed something. And that's number one thing that we begin with. Our new cohort, the Exmoors that have just joined the school and started on Monday, their first week is observation. Their first week is now we have to start looking at the hoof capsule, looking at inside the foot. What's the connection between the two? So our studies where we show these horses rehabbing publicly, we do it month by month, and you can see them on, you go to Gauze with Track Livery on Facebook, you can see it there. Go to the Hoofing Marvellous page, we often post up some of the x-rays on there as well, where we're showing you what happens to these feet if you systematically control the parameters in the trim. What happens to the inside of these feet? What happens to these animals? Do they get better or do they get worse? Now, obviously, we're not trying to experiment, but we're just doing the thing that I did for many years, which is recover these animals from catastrophic hoof distortions through better hoof care. And these animals get better. Now, there are some animals that come to us or want to come to us, owners want to bring them to us, that have horrible osteonecrosis. Those animals can never go back to a normal life, a normal sound life. Those animals have to be looked after every few days with their hoof care, not every few weeks. Life is tricky for an animal that's had its hoof capsule played around with for years and months by various different people with various different ideas. Nobody actually trimming the horse to its own anatomical needs, because everybody argues over it. So, don't stifle critical thinking. Don't stifle people who are out there going out and studying these horses and understanding what anatomical balance means, especially if you don't. Don't try and put us down because you are stuck in a belief system that has no real answers and just a tiny bit of information on a much wider picture that doesn't pinpoint a disease being the problem. So that was what my walking it through today was. 40 minutes. I hope you've enjoyed it, and me and Pinky are nearly at the end of our walk now. It's been beautiful. It's super overcast, but it's not cold. I'm actually really hot in my jumper, and we had massive thunderstorm and lightning during the early hours of this morning. So I better get home because I've got washing on the line, which is probably soaked during the night now. All right then, my lovelies. I hope you enjoyed that, and maybe I'll show you a behind the scenes video on Friday. But don't forget to go back and see these rocket science lessons, and don't forget to get onto one of our workshops, because our workshops we put on all through the year in different countries in the world. The next one we've got coming up is in Sweden. Of course, when you look at this in a year's time or so, that will be gone and done and gone. But go to the Phoenix Way Path to Hoof Health group on Facebook, or even on the Hoofing Marvellous page, and you'll find links to our workshops, maybe even in the description below. Get on a workshop, handle these feet, try and start to understand what we're talking about with anatomical balance, try and understand what we're talking about when we're showing you these monthly x-rays, and learn how to be a better owner who is more observant of the horse's feet, whether they're trimming or not, and learn how to keep your horse sound by keeping their feet in balance. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'll see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.